Hello, my name is Susan. I'm 63 years old, and I want to tell you a story that changed my life forever. One night, my twin sister showed up at my door, covered in bruises, her eyes swollen from crying. She whispered, he said, no one would believe me. My heart broke right there. I held her trembling hands and promised, then let me be you for a while. The next morning, we switched clothes, we switched lives. And for the first time, her husband met a woman who looked exactly like his victim, but who wasn't afraid to fight back. What happened next would uncover secrets darker than I ever imagined. Lies, danger, and a truth that would turn our world upside down. But before we continue, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love reading your messages and knowing where you are. Now let's uncover how this story really began. That night still feels like a bruise on my heart. I can recall every sound, the rain tapping against my window, the low hum of the refrigerator, the clock ticking like it was waiting for something to happen. Then came the knock. 3 slow, uneven taps, like someone gathering courage between each one. When I opened the door, Janet was standing there, my twin. My mirror in another life. But that night, she looked like a ghost of herself. Her face was swollen and streaked with tears and mascara. Her coat was soaked through, her body trembling as though even the air hurt to touch. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I just reached out and pulled her into my arms, feeling her ribs through her thin sweater. He said no one would believe me, she whispered. Her voice cracked on the last word, breaking into small pieces that fell between us. I felt her breath against my neck, shallow, scared. I led her inside, closed the door, and locked it twice. In the kitchen, I made her tea, though I knew she wouldn't drink much. Her hands shook so badly the cup rattled against the saucer. Under the harsh light, I saw the purple shadows on her wrists, the faint outline of fingerprints. I reached across the table, gently turning her arm so I could see better. She tried to pull away, ashamed, but I held her hand and said softly, "You don't have to hide from me." Her eyes filled again. "Susan, he said I deserved it. That if I ever told anyone, he'd make me regret it. It wasn't the first time I'd suspected. Over the years, there had been hints, the phone calls cut short. The nervous laughter when I asked how things were going, the way she'd flinch when someone raised their voice nearby. But seeing the bruises, was different. It was truth made flesh. I sat beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're safe here. He can't touch you now." She nodded, but her eyes were far away, trapped somewhere I couldn't reach. That night, she slept in my bed while I stayed in the chair by the window, watching the rain. I could hear her breathing unevenly, the occasional whimper slipping out between dreams. And I thought, how could 2 women born on the same day, from the same mother, end up living such different lives? I had Peter, steady and kind, and a home filled with peace. She had Mark, a man who drained the light from her. When dawn came, pale and gray, I walked into the kitchen and found her sitting at the table again, clutching her tea like it might anchor her to the world. She looked at me, eyes hollow but searching. "What do I do, Suzanne? If I go back, he'll kill me. But if I leave, he'll find me." Something in me hardened. I'd spent my life helping others, at the community center, in our church, with strangers who needed a hand. But this was different. This was blood. My own sister. I couldn't stand by. "Then let me be you for a while," I heard myself say. Her head snapped up. "What? You said he'd never believe anyone would help you. Then let's make him believe you're still there. I'll take your place. I'll see what he's like when someone looks him in the eye." Her lips parted in disbelief. "Susan, no. He's dangerous. You don't know what he's capable of." "I know enough. And I know you can't go back. Not yet. Let me do this." For a long moment, the room was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock. Then she nodded. tears sliding down her cheeks again. We spent the next hours preparing. She showed me her closet, the soft pastel sweaters, the delicate scarves, the perfume she always wore. I noticed how everything about her life seemed small, careful, muted, as though she'd learned to take up as little space as possible. I put on one of her blouses, brushed my hair the way she did, and studied my reflection in the mirror. It was eerie how easily we could trade faces. Same eyes, same hands, same faint scar above the lip from when we were 10 and fell off our bikes. But in her reflection, I saw fear. In mine, I saw resolve. When I turned around, she was standing behind me, her expression torn between gratitude and guilt. "If he hurts you, he won't," I interrupted gently. "He won't know who he's dealing with." That afternoon, I drove to her house, her prison really, while she stayed at mine, safe behind locked doors. The sky was still gray, heavy with unshed rain. My heart pounded as I pulled into the driveway. Every instinct screamed to turn back, but I didn't. I owed her that much. The house smelled of him, expensive cologne and anger. Mark was sitting in the living room, scrolling through his phone. He barely glanced up when I walked in. "You're late," he muttered. "Dinner should have been ready an hour ago." The words were ordinary, but the tone behind them made my stomach clench. Janet must have lived like this every day, measuring each breath against his moods. I set my purse down, steadying my voice. "I got caught in traffic." He looked up, eyes narrowing slightly as if something felt off. But he said nothing more, just returned to his phone. I busied myself in the kitchen, pretending to know where everything was. My hands trembled as I searched for a pan. The walls felt too close, the silence too loud. When I accidentally dropped a spoon, he shouted from the other room, "Careful, Janet!" The way he said her name, like an insult, made my blood run cold. When he finally entered the kitchen, he stood too close behind me. "You've been quiet today," he said. "I've had a lot on my mind." He laughed, a low, mocking sound. "Don't start with that emotional nonsense. You women and your feelings." Something in me snapped. I turned to face him. "Don't you dare speak to me like that." The words came out sharp, icy, unfamiliar even to my own ears. His expression froze, disbelief flickering across his face. He studied me like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "What did you say?" I held his gaze. "You heard me." The air between us went still. Then, with a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes, he said, "You're different today." I forced a small smile of my own. Maybe I am. That night, when he went to bed, I stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the dark window. My heart was still racing, my palms slick with sweat. I knew then how dangerous this would be, but I also knew I couldn't stop now. For the first time in years, someone had stood up to him, even if he didn't know who she really was. And I promised myself, right there in the quiet of that house, that I would not let my sister live in fear any longer. Whatever it took, I would see this through. For 3 days, I lived as my sister. 3 days inside her world of muted colors and quiet fear, where every word had to be measured, every movement soft so it wouldn't draw attention. From the outside, it might have seemed ordinary, a husband, a wife, a neat little house with flowers by the porch. But behind those curtains, every breath carried the weight of survival. I kept a small journal hidden beneath the loose floorboard in the guest room closet. Each night, after Mark had fallen asleep, I'd kneel on the cold wood and write in near darkness, recording every word, every glance, every tightening of his jaw. The pen felt like a lifeline, a way to remind myself who I really was. Sometimes, I wrote little notes to Janet, too. Small pieces of sisterly love I could never say aloud in that house. "You are not broken. You are still here." Mark's cruelty wasn't loud, not at first. It lived in the details, the way he'd correct the way I buttered toast, the way he'd glance at my outfit and say, That's not really flattering on you, is it? He'd scroll through Janet's phone, frowning at messages from coworkers, accusing her of things she hadn't done. His words had the rhythm of routine, the precision of someone who had practiced this dance for years. "Where were you this afternoon?" he asked one evening as I set the table. "At the market," I said. "Careful, even." He smirked. "You've been going there a lot lately. You sure you're not meeting someone?" I forced a small laugh, though my throat burned. "I think you'd notice if I had the energy for that." He didn't smile back. He just stared, long enough for discomfort to spread like a rash across my skin. Later, when he tasted the soup, he frowned. Too salty. Again, I bit my tongue until I tasted blood. I reminded myself why I was there, not to argue, not to provoke, but to see, to understand, to gather proof. Still, it took every ounce of strength not to tell him that a man who crushed his wife's spirit had no right to complain about soup. On the second day, I met Mrs. Patterson. She was an elderly widow who lived next door, her white hair always pinned up in a neat bun. She waved to me from her porch, her eyes bright with the kind of kindness that had gone extinct inside that house. I walked over, pretending to be Janet as best I could. "Oh, dear, I haven't seen you in a while," she said. "Everything all right?" I hesitated, then nodded. "Just busy." Her smile faltered slightly. "I've heard some shouting now and then." I never wanted to pry, but she stopped herself, searching my face. "Just know that you're not alone, sweetheart. If you ever need to come over, my door is open." Her words landed like a small mercy. I wanted to hug her, to tell her who I really was. But I couldn't. I just smiled weakly and thanked her, the tears already stinging my eyes as I walked back to the house that didn't feel like mine. That night, during dinner, I made the mistake of correcting Mark when he misremembered something about his business partner, Richard. It was small, barely worth noting. But he stopped mid-bite, his fork frozen in the air. "What did you just say?" I said Richard told me. His hand shot across the table, gripping my wrist with sudden force. The pain was sharp, blooming instantly beneath his fingers. My instinct was to pull away, to shrink like Janet would have, but I didn't. I met his eyes instead. "Let go," I said quietly. For a moment, the air felt thick, charged. His eyes searched mine, and I could see confusion flicker behind the anger. This wasn't the reaction he expected. He was used to tears, to apologies, to silence. Not this stillness. Not defiance. He released me slowly, almost curious. "You're different today," he murmured. I rubbed my wrist under the table, steadying my breathing. "Maybe I've just had enough." He didn't reply. But I saw it then, the first crack in his control. The tiniest seed of doubt planted in his mind. When he went to his office after dinner, I slipped into the bathroom with my own phone, the one I'd hidden in the lining of my suitcase. My hands shook as I turned it on. The screen lit up, and with it a small part of the world that still belonged to me. There were missed calls, messages from Peter. I hesitated before calling back, afraid even the sound of his voice would break me open. When he answered, it was immediate. "Susan? Oh, thank God, where are you? What's going on?" Hearing him, the tenderness, the worry made my throat tighten. "I'm fine," I whispered. "I'm helping Janet. Baby, I miss you," he said softly. "When are you coming home?" His voice wrapped around me like warmth after a long winter. I closed my eyes, leaning against the cool tile wall. I wanted to tell him everything, how frightened I was, how much I hated pretending, how every second felt like walking through glass. But I couldn't risk it. Soon, I managed. Just a few more days. He sighed. "Please be careful. I don't like this, Susan. Something doesn't feel right." Before I could answer, a faint sound made my stomach drop, the floor creaking outside the door. I froze. "Peter," I whispered, my pulse hammering. "I have to go." Susan, I ended the call, slipping the phone back into my pocket. My reflection in the mirror looked pale, wild-eyed. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart, then opened the door. Mark was standing there. His expression was unreadable, calm in a way that made my skin crawl. Who were you talking to? No one, I said quickly. Just checking messages. He took a slow step closer. You're lying. I forced myself to meet his gaze, every muscle in my body trembling. I said it was nothing. The silence stretched between us, tight as a wire. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled, a small, chilling thing that didn't reach his eyes. If I find out you're keeping secrets from me, Janet, you'll regret it. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just stood there, watching him walk away, my hands still shaking at my sides. When the door to his study closed, I let out the breath I'd been holding and pressed my palms to my face. My heart ached, not only from fear, but from the unbearable truth that this was Janet's every day. This careful balancing act between terror and endurance, between surviving and disappearing. That night, as I wrote in my hidden journal, my tears smudged the ink. He knows something is off. I have to be careful. But I can't stop now. For Janet, for Emily, for every woman who ever had to whisper instead of scream. The pen trembled in my hand, but I kept writing, the words becoming a silent vow. I will not fail her. The evening air felt heavy, the way Charleston humidity sometimes clings to the skin long after the sun has set. The house, too, seemed to breathe uneasily, its old wooden floors creaking in small gasps as Susan, wearing Janet's cardigan, Janet's perfume, Janet's life moved quietly through the living room. She could sense the storm before it came, the way tension gathers like static in the air, invisible but electric. Mark's voice shattered the silence. "Where were you?" He stood in the doorway, his tie loosened, his eyes bloodshot with drink or fury. It didn't matter which. The sight of him, so near and so suddenly loud, sent a sharp pulse through her chest. She studied her breath. "I told you," she said softly. "At the community center, I was helping with the food drive." Mark laughed without humor. "Don't lie to me, Janet." His lips barely moved. "You think I'm stupid? You think I don't know where you go?" Something inside her went cold. There it was. The same sentence Janet had whispered the night she arrived at Susan's door, trembling. "He said no one would believe me." "What do you mean?" Susan asked carefully, though her heart began to pound. Mark's hand twitched toward his pocket. "I've seen the locations. Every stop. Every hour." He pulled out his phone, opened an app, and there, mapped out like a criminal trail, was Janet's entire life, dotted in red circles. The realization struck like a slap. He'd been tracking her. For months. Susan's face remained calm, but her blood surged with disbelief and disgust. Later, when Mark went upstairs to shower, she searched Janet's phone. Her fingers trembled as she found the hidden app buried deep among settings, disguised as a weather widget. Spyware, an open window into every call, every text, every movement. Her hands tightened around the phone until her knuckles blanched. She felt both rage and nausea. He had turned her sister's existence into a cage she couldn't even see. When Mark returned, towel draped around his neck, she was standing by the kitchen counter, the phone placed there like evidence. "You tracked me," she said, each word measured. Mark froze. His expression hardened into something between guilt and arrogance. "I needed to know where you were. You disappear. You lie." "I help people at the community center, Mark," she said, her voice low but unshaking. "That's where I've been." "That's where your wife has been." The silence that followed was long and dangerous. He took a step closer, and she saw it, his facade cracking like old paint. "Don't talk to me like that," he growled. "And how should I talk to you?" The moment snapped. He grabbed her shoulders, his grip iron. Before she could react, he shoved her hard against the wall. Her head struck the plaster with a dull thud, and the shock of it stole her breath. It lasted only a second. Then his hands dropped away, trembling. "Oh, God, Janet," he stammered. "I didn't mean, you made me angry. You know how I get. I'm sorry. I went too far again." Susan's heart pounded, but her mind remained sharp. While he covered his face, mumbling apologies, she reached for her phone on the counter and quietly pressed record. His voice was small now, broken. "I'm sorry, okay? I just love you too much sometimes. It makes me crazy." She let him speak, every word another stone sinking into the dark water of evidence. When he finally retreated upstairs, she stood motionless for a long while, feeling the weight of the moment settle deep in her bones. Later that night, as the house sighed into silence, Susan sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling through old photos of Janet and her daughter, Emily. In one, Emily was only 12, her smile soft and shy. She wondered if the girl knew, if she understood the truth of the home she'd grown up in. Her thoughts were interrupted by a buzz. A video call. "Emily." Susan answered immediately, forcing a tired smile. "Sweetheart?" Emily's face appeared, pale and tear-streaked, surrounded by the cold sterility of a dorm room. "Mom," she whispered, "he's getting worse, isn't he?" The words pierced through Susan like a blade. She saw the fear behind them. The same fear Janet had carried in her eyes that night. The fear of a child who'd learned too early that safety could vanish with a single shout. "Oh, Emily." Her throat tightened. "Where are you, darling?" "I'm still at school. I've been avoiding coming home on weekends. I just can't. He calls and yells, but I don't pick up. Mom said she'd handle it, but I know she's just protecting me." Emily covered her face. "I can't sleep anymore. I keep thinking, what if something happens to her?" Susan blinked hard, swallowing her tears. She wanted to tell her everything, that her mother was safe, that she was fighting, that justice was coming. But before she could speak, footsteps thundered down the stairs. Mark's voice was suddenly behind her. "Who are you talking to?" He appeared beside her before she could react. His shadow fell across the screen, and Emily's eyes widened in terror. "Mom! No!" she cried. Mark snatched the phone from Susan's hand, ending the call with one swift motion. The sound of the disconnection, abrupt, cruel, hung in the air like the crack of a whip. Susan turned to him slowly, meeting his gaze. What she saw there was no longer just anger or control. It was something deeper, something hollow and gleaming, like oil on water. For the first time, she saw pure evil staring back. They stood frozen, a battle of silence. His breathing was heavy. Hers was steady but shallow. The wall behind her still bore the faint mark from where he'd shoved her. "Don't ever talk to her again without me," Mark said, his voice low, controlled, deadly. Susan nodded faintly, her body trembling beneath the mask of submission. Inside, though, something irreversible had shifted. She felt the flame ignite, not of fear, but of resolve. When he finally turned and walked away, muttering to himself, she stayed in place, listening to the echo of his steps fade up the stairs. Then, with shaking hands, she unlocked her phone again. The recording was still there, his apology, his confession, and now she had a reason even stronger than justice to keep fighting. Emily, the girl her sister had been trying to shield. The daughter who'd hidden herself away to escape the same monster now pacing above them. Susan sat in the dim light for a long time, letting the tears come quietly. They were not just hers, they were Janet's, and Emily's, and every woman who'd been made small to survive. Somewhere in that darkness, between fear and defiance, she felt a quiet vow take root inside her. He thought he'd married a woman he could break. He didn't know yet that he was now facing one who'd already walked through the fire and come back whole. Susan wiped her tears, straightened her shoulders, and whispered into the empty room, "You've gone too far for the last time." The night air pressed close around the house, thick and waiting. But this time, Susan didn't feel trapped. She felt awake. The first crack had opened, and through it, light was beginning to pour. The days after Emily's call settled over the house like a silent fog, dense, heavy, and waiting to be disturbed. Susan woke each morning inside Jeanette's world, but the illusion no longer felt like disguise. It had become armor. Every movement, every word was now deliberate, purposeful. She wasn't just surviving Mark's temper anymore. She was collecting truth piece by piece, stitching together the story of a life crushed under his control. She began with the bruises. The fading marks along her arms, remnants from the wall, from his hands, were no longer only a source of shame. They were evidence. Under the soft morning light, she photographed them one by one, careful to capture the subtle shades of purple and yellow that told a timeline of healing and harm. She saved the images in a secret folder under a mundane name, Recipes. Each click of the camera made her heart race, but also steadier. Truth was her weapon now. When Mark left for work, she found his messages on Janet's phone threads of accusation, control, demands for proof of where she was. She took screenshots quietly, storing them alongside the recordings. Then she stared at the words long enough for them to lose their shape, becoming just black strokes on a glowing screen. Yet beneath their cold surface, she could still feel Janet's pain. Years of walking on eggshells, apologizing for things she hadn't done, erasing parts of herself to survive. The next step terrified her more than any bruise ever had. Susan made an appointment with Janet's doctor. She wore her sister's clothes, mimicked her quiet tone. And when the nurse called Mrs. Chun, she raised her hand with a calm she didn't feel. Dr. Williams was a soft-spoken man in his 60s. His eyes carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much and been able to say too little. He examined the healing marks on her arm with clinical precision, but a deep sadness lingered behind his glasses. "You've had quite a few falls lately," he said gently. Susan forced a small smile. "Yes, I'm clumsy, I suppose." His pen paused midair. Then he looked at her, really looked. "Mrs. Chun," he said quietly, "you know I have to report patterns." Her breath caught. The words hung between them like a fragile thread. She wanted to tell him everything, to confess that she wasn't Janet, that she was here to protect her sister, but the truth was too dangerous to speak aloud. Instead, she met his gaze and let a single tear escape. It wasn't a performance. It was everything she couldn't say. He nodded slowly, understanding more than she could tell him. When she left, he slipped her a card discreetly. A women's shelter, an emergency hotline. She tucked it into her purse, her fingers trembling. For the first time, she realized how many people had seen Janet's suffering and how silence had been their shared prison. That night, when Mark returned home, she noticed how he watched her. His eyes moved over her face like searchlights, hunting for the slightest hint of rebellion. She smiled at him, gentle, practiced, and unbroken. Inside, her resolve hardened further. At the end of the week, Mark announced they'd been invited to a company barbecue. "Richard's hosting," he said, pouring himself a drink. "You'll come, of course. Try not to talk too much." Susan's pulse quickened. Richard, Mark's business partner. The man who shared everything with him: profits, secrets, reputation. She saw it as an opportunity. The afternoon of the barbecue was golden and warm, the kind of Charleston day that pretends life is simple. Families laughed under string lights, children chased one another on the lawn, and Mark played his role to perfection. He charmed everyone, smiling too wide, his arm heavy on her shoulder. To outsiders, they looked enviable, successful, elegant, unshakable. But when Richard caught Susan's eye, something in his expression shifted. Later, as she stood near the edge of the garden sipping iced tea, he approached quietly. "Janet," he murmured, keeping his gaze on the horizon, "if you ever need help, if things get bad, Mark's not the man everyone thinks he is." Her throat tightened. "Why would you say that?" He hesitated, glancing toward the house where Mark was laughing too loudly. Let's just say I've seen his temper. And I've seen the books. She turned to him, heart racing. The books? Richard nodded once subtly. He's been moving money. Private accounts. Offshore. I told him it's risky, but he doesn't listen. Someday, it'll all come crashing down. And when it does, I don't want you caught in it. He looked at her then, his expression weary, almost protective. You didn't hear it from me. She thanked him softly, masking her shock behind a polite smile, but inside, her thoughts swirled like a storm. Mark wasn't just cruel, he was criminal. Every mask he wore was starting to crack. The next week, Susan went further. She visited Mark's office under the pretext of bringing him lunch. While waiting in the reception area, she struck up a conversation with his secretary, Linda, a nervous young woman with bitten nails and downcast eyes. You're brave, Linda said after a pause, lowering her voice. Coming here so often. When he's in one of his moods, no one wants to be near him. Susan leaned closer. His moods? Linda looked toward the office door, then back. I've seen him yell at Richard, slam things. Once, he broke a glass against the wall. Everyone pretends it didn't happen. Her hands twisted together. Just be careful, Mrs. Chun. Susan gave a soft smile. Thank you, Linda. That means more than you know. When she left, her hands trembled around the steering wheel. Every person she encountered seemed to hold one small piece of the puzzle, a glimpse of the monster behind the polished suit. And she was gathering them all, quietly, methodically. Still, she couldn't ignore the weight pressing against her heart. Peter had begun calling more often, his voice laced with worry. Susan, you've been gone for weeks, he said one evening over the phone. I barely hear from you anymore. What's going on? She turned toward the window, watching the amber light spill across the street. It's a family emergency, she said softly. Janet needs me right now. I can't explain more yet. There was a long silence on the other end. You sound tired, Peter finally said. Please don't forget to take care of yourself. His gentleness almost broke her. I won't, she whispered. Thank you. When she hung up, she pressed her forehead to the cool glass. She missed him, missed being herself. But she couldn't go back, not yet. Not when Emily and Janet's safety depended on how well she played her part. 2 nights later, Mark came home early, his energy strangely buoyant. Good news, he said, tossing his jacket onto the couch. We're going to the company gala in 2 weeks. Black tie. Big night. Everyone who matters will be there. Susan smiled faintly, her mind already racing. That sounds lovely. He grinned, his charm restored. It'll be good for you to be seen again. People will talk if you keep hiding. She laughed softly, masking her unease. Then we'll give them something to talk about. When he left the room, she stared at her reflection in the mirror. Her eyes, Janet's eyes, looked back, tired but alive. The gala would bring everyone together. Mark, Richard, his colleagues, the people who believed the lie of his perfect life. It would also bring her the chance to expose him, to make the invisible visible. The thought both terrified and strengthened her. She could feel the weight of every secret she carried pressing against her chest, but she was no longer alone beneath it. Behind her, unseen yet ever present, were the women who had endured: Janet, Emily, Linda, even Dr. Williams and his silent compassion. As she turned off the lights and prepared for bed, she whispered into the dark, "We're getting close." The house creaked softly in response, as if acknowledging her vow. And in that small sound, Susan found courage, not the loud, defiant kind, but the quiet, unyielding kind that grows in the shadows, patient and unstoppable. She lay awake for a long time, listening to Mark's rhythmic breathing beside her, the man who believed he still had control. But in the stillness, she understood something profound. Power was shifting. The truth was gathering strength, and soon it would no longer whisper, it would roar. The night the sisters reunited, the air smelled faintly of rain, like the world itself had paused to listen. Susan sat at her kitchen table, 2 cups of tea steaming between them, as the woman across from her, her mirror and her ghost, lifted her trembling hands to her face. Janet's eyes were swollen, her cheeks pale beneath the soft kitchen light. But there was something else there now too, something fragile and new. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was the first flicker of courage daring to return. They had switched back that morning, quietly, safely. Susan had driven Janet from the shelter where she'd been hiding, her hand steady on the wheel, though her heart trembled with the weight of all she had to reveal. Now, back in her own home, surrounded by the scent of lemon soap and lavender, she could finally breathe as herself again. But the relief was brief. There was too much truth to share. "I don't even know where to start," Susan whispered, stirring her tea, though she hadn't taken a sip. "Start at the beginning," Janet said softly, her voice barely there. "I need to know." Susan took a slow breath and began to speak. She told her everything about the spyware, the tracking, the doctor who'd almost reported the accidents, about the barbecue where Richard had confessed to seeing Mark's temper, about Linda and the fear that lived quietly in that office. She showed her the photographs, the recordings, the screenshots, each one a wound and a weapon. Janet's eyes filled with tears. Her hands trembled so hard that the teaspoon clattered against the saucer. I never thought anyone would believe me," she whispered. "He made sure of that. He said I'd lose everything if I spoke." Susan reached across the table and took her hands in her own. They were cold and fragile, like bird wings, but Susan held them firmly. "You haven't lost everything," she said gently. "You're here. Emily's safe. And we have proof now." Janet's gaze met hers, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I never thought I'd have the courage to fight him." Susan smiled faintly, her own eyes shining. "You always had it, Janet. You just needed someone to see it first." The room fell quiet except for the soft patter of rain against the window. They sat together, the silence between them thick with unspoken years, childhood laughter, distance, regret, and now something redemptive blooming between the cracks. The storm outside felt almost cleansing. After a while, Susan pulled out a small notepad and began to write. "We need someone who can help us build this into a case. Someone who knows the law, who's seen monsters like him before." Janet nodded slowly. "Do you know anyone?" "I do." Susan opened her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she'd saved from her days volunteering at the community center, Gloria Martinez. "She runs a legal clinic for survivors of domestic violence. If anyone can help us, it's her." They called that afternoon, voices low, hearts pounding. Gloria's tone on the other end was firm yet kind, the kind of voice that made you feel safe even while walking through fire. "Bring everything you have," she said. "Tomorrow morning my office at 9. That night, neither sister slept much. Janet lay awake in the guest room, the shadows of her past whispering through the dark, while Susan sat by the kitchen window, staring out at the rain-soaked street. She thought of Emily, of the recordings, of Mark's eyes that night when the mask had slipped. She had seen evil before, in stories, in the people she helped, but never so close, never so intimate. Now, it was personal. The next morning, they arrived at Gloria's office, a small space filled with books, framed certificates, and the scent of strong coffee. Gloria herself was in her 40s, with dark curls pulled into a bun and eyes that held both steel and warmth. She shook their hands firmly and gestured for them to sit. "Show me what you've got," she said. Susan handed over a neatly organized folder, printed texts, photos, timestamps, recordings, notes. Gloria flipped through each page, her expression focused, her pen tapping occasionally against the desk. When she finished, she leaned back, letting out a low exhale. This, she said, looking at Susan with something like awe, is exactly what we need. You've done in weeks what takes most women years to gather. You may have just built the foundation of a criminal case. Janet's breath hitched, her hand flying to her chest. You mean, you think they'll believe me? Gloria nodded. With this kind of evidence? Yes, especially when we can show a pattern. Susan frowned. A pattern? Gloria's tone softened, but her words carried weight. There's something you should know. Mark Chun has been on my radar before. The room seemed to tilt. Before? Susan repeated. Gloria opened a drawer and pulled out an old file, edges worn. His first wife, Lydia. She died 12 years ago. The death was ruled accidental, a fall down the stairs, but there were whispers. Neighbors reported fights, late-night arguments. A few bruises noted in her medical records, though she always had an excuse. Janet pressed a hand to her mouth, trembling. He told me she slipped in heels, she whispered. He said it happened in their old house. Gloria's eyes met theirs, grave. I've always suspected there was more to it, but without evidence, nothing could be done. Until now. The words settled like stones in their chests. Susan felt her stomach twist, grief and fury tangling together. So he's done this before, and he almost got away with it. Janet's tears spilled freely now. He killed her, didn't he? Gloria didn't answer directly. Let's just say this time, he won't have the same ending. Silence stretched for a long moment. Then Susan reached for her sister's hand again, their fingers interlacing, trembling but firm. We're not just fighting for you anymore, Susan said softly. We're fighting for her too, for Lydia, and for every woman who came before us. Janet nodded through her tears. And for Emily, she whispered. Gloria leaned forward. If we do this right, we can bring him down completely, but we'll need to be careful. Men like him, they sense when control is slipping. Susan straightened her shoulders. Then we'll give him control, just enough to make him feel safe. And then we'll take it away, piece by piece. Gloria studied her, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. You've got a fire in you, Mrs. Thompson. I like that. When they left the office, the sky was clearing, a fragile light breaking through the clouds. They walked side by side in silence, the world around them bustling with ordinary life cars passing. People laughing, unaware of the quiet revolution unfolding in two women's hearts. Back at Susan's house, the sisters sat again at the kitchen table. This time, the tea was cold, forgotten, but their minds were alive with purpose. Janet traced the rim of her cup absently. How are we going to do this? How do we make him face what he's done? Susan's eyes found hers, steady and fierce. At the gala, she said simply, He wants the world to see his perfect life? Fine. We'll show them the truth instead. Janet stared at her for a moment, then nodded slowly. He'll never see it coming. Outside, the clouds parted completely, sunlight spilling through the window onto their joined hands. It wasn't over, not even close, but for the first time in years, Janet allowed herself to imagine a life beyond fear. As Susan watched her sister's face soften in the light, she realized something profound. Courage wasn't born in the absence of fear, but in the decision to rise anyway. And together they would rise not just for survival, but for justice, for truth, for all the women whose stories had been buried in silence. The plan was forming, fragile, but real. The gala would be their stage, and Mark's downfall would begin with two women who refused to stay invisible any longer. The days before the gala moved slowly, each one a held breath, each hour taut with expectation. In Susan's house, the walls had become witnesses to whispered strategy, quiet tears, and a kind of hope neither sister had dared to name before. The plan was delicate, dangerous, but it gave shape to something greater than revenge. It was the first time in years that Janet, sitting across from her sister, didn't look small. She looked alive. They began practicing the switch again, this time with precision. Every detail mattered: the way Janet walked, how she tilted her head when she spoke, how Susan's voice softened into her sister's tone. They took turns observing each other, correcting, repeating, until they were seamless mirrors. "Your hair should fall over your left shoulder," Susan said one morning, gently tucking a strand in place. "You always did that when you were nervous. He'll expect it." Janet nodded, breathing shallowly. "I keep forgetting how much he notices it." "That's why we'll make him notice what we choose," Susan said, meeting her eyes in the mirror. Janet gave a faint smile, then looked down at her hands. The bruises had faded into yellow ghosts. She touched them lightly, as if to confirm they were real. "I can't believe I'm doing this," she whispered. Susan rested a hand on her shoulder. "You already have. You've been surviving him for years. This time, you're not surviving. You're fighting." It was late afternoon when the door opened and Emily stepped inside. The young woman looked older than her years, her eyes shadowed with sleepless nights, but there was something fierce in her expression, her mother's strength reborn. When she saw Janet, she froze, her breath catching. "Mom," Emily said, voice trembling, before running forward and wrapping her arms around her mother. Janet clung to her like she was afraid she might vanish again. For a moment, words were impossible. Then Emily pulled back just enough to look at them both. "Mom, Aunt Susan, tell me what to do." Her jaw was set, her voice steady despite the tears glistening in her eyes. Susan exhaled softly, both moved and protective. "Emily, you've done enough already. You're safe. That's what matters." But Emily shook her head. "No, I'm done being afraid. I want to help." Her convictions silenced them. Janet touched her daughter's face gently, memorizing her strength. "All right," she said softly. "You can help us. But you must promise to stay close to Susan during the gala, no matter what happens." Emily nodded. "I promise." It was Susan who made the next call to Peter. She had avoided it for days, knowing his voice would undo her. When he answered, his relief was immediate, followed by sharp anger. "Damn it, Susan," he said, his voice breaking between fury and fear. "You've been living with that man pretending to be her. Do you realize what could have happened?" "I know," she whispered. "I had to." Janet couldn't face him again without proof. There was a long silence on the line. Then his tone softened, all the anger folding into care. "You should have told me sooner. I couldn't risk anyone finding out." "Well, you're not doing this alone anymore." That night, Peter came over. The moment he saw Janet, he understood everything. He listened as they laid out their plan, his hands clenched, his eyes burning with quiet rage. When Susan finished, he nodded. "My brother owes me a favor," he said. "He's a detective. We'll get legal backup. Discreet, but ready to step in the second things turn." Hope flickered through the room like a spark catching dry wood. For the first time, the plan didn't just feel like an act of defiance. It felt possible. The next few days blurred into movement and emotion. Janet rehearsed every line she might need to say, every step of the confrontation. She and Susan stood side by side before the mirror, practicing posture and breath. At first, Janet's voice wavered, thin as glass. But Susan stood behind her, guiding her with quiet words. Again, she said gently, "Say it like you believe it." Janet looked at her reflection, her face pale, but her eyes fierce. "I am strong," she said, her voice trembling. Susan nodded. Again, "I am believed." Again, "I deserve respect." This time her voice broke, but she didn't stop. The tears came, silent and fierce, but the words grew stronger, filling the room like a prayer, like the reclaiming of something sacred. When she finished, Susan pressed a kiss to the back of her sister's hand. That's the woman who's going to walk into that gala. By the third night, the plan was set. Peter's brother, Detective Henry Collins, had arranged a small team ready to act the moment Susan sent the signal. Cameras, hidden microphones, a live audio feed, all approved by the lawyer, Gloria Martinez. Every detail had been mapped out, every risk considered. Meanwhile, Mark seemed almost smug in his calmness. He believed the storm had passed, that his obedient wife had finally learned her place again. He noticed Janet's new gentleness, her soft responses, and mistook them for surrender. "You're different lately," he told her one evening, slipping an arm around her waist as they stood by the mirror. "More like the woman I married." Janet's smile was thin, practiced. "I'm just trying to make things right." He kissed her cheek. "Good. Let's keep it that way." When he left the room, her reflection met Susan's from the doorway. The expression they shared said everything: fear, revulsion, resolve. That night, Mark brought home a garment bag and laid it on the bed with a grin that made Janet's stomach twist. "For the gala," he said. "Wear this one." Susan unzipped it slowly. Inside hung a deep red dress, sleek, form-fitting, expensive. It was beautiful, but there was nothing kind about it. It was a symbol of ownership, of control. Janet stared at it for a long time. "He bought this for me years ago," she whispered. "The first time he hit me was the night I wore it." Susan's breath caught. "You don't have to wear it." "I do," Janet said quietly, her fingers brushing the fabric. "He expects it. If I don't, he'll know something's wrong." Tears filled Susan's eyes, but she nodded. "Then wear it. But this time, it won't be his power you're wearing, it'll be your armor." Janet smiled faintly, the corner of her mouth trembling. "You always know what to say." The 3 days leading up to the gala passed in fragments polishing evidence, rehearsing the timing, coordinating with Gloria and Detective Collins. Emily typed notes late into the night, her young face lit by the glow of her laptop, while Susan and Janet whispered over coffee, running through their lines like actors preparing for a final act. Sometimes, the weight of it all would hit Susan suddenly. The memory of Mark's hands, Janet's bruises, the way Emily's voice had cracked over the phone, it all came rushing back. But then she'd look at her sister, sitting straighter now, her voice firm, her eyes no longer hollow. And she knew why they were doing this. On the eve of the gala, they sat together once more in the kitchen, the same table, the same 2 cups of tea, the same fragile light of early evening. Emily leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, and Susan reached for both their hands. "Tomorrow changes everything," she said softly. "No more hiding, no more fear." Janet nodded. "Tomorrow, we end it." Outside, the world was quiet, unaware of the storm that was coming. But inside that small kitchen, 3 women sat together in the glow of a single lamp, bound not by blood alone, but by shared pain, resilience, and the unbreakable belief that even the most shattered life could be pieced back together with truth and courage. And as the clock ticked toward midnight, Susan whispered the words she wanted Janet to carry with her into that night of reckoning. "You are seen. You are safe. And he can't take that away anymore." The Charleston Harbor Resort glowed like a crown that night, its windows lit with gold and white. A soft coastal wind carried the scent of salt and magnolias through the air as the waves lapped against the docks outside. Inside, the ballroom had been transformed. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead, scattering light like broken stars across marble floors. The string quartet played a lilting waltz, laughter and champagne flowing in equal measure. It was a night designed for appearances, glamour masking greed, applause disguising decay. Susan stood just beyond the main doors, her heart thudding in her chest. She had memorized every part of the plan, every movement, every cue, but now that she was here, surrounded by the murmur of Charleston's elite, it felt unreal. She looked radiant in her silver gown, the same cut and fabric as Janet's, her hair styled in soft curls that brushed her shoulders. The resemblance between them was uncanny, two reflections, one truth divided in half. Across the courtyard, Jeanette was arriving at that very moment. She stepped out of the car slowly, one hand gripping her small silver purse, the other clutching the door for balance. Her gown shimmered like moonlight, catching every glint from the entrance lights. It was not the red dress Mark had chosen for her. It was hers, her choice. The defiance in that decision alone made her pulse quicken. The valet offered his arm, but she shook her head. "I can walk, thank you," she murmured, steadying herself. Her heels clicked softly against the marble as she entered, the soft chatter around her dimming just slightly. People turned to look. She had been invisible for so long, and now she was impossible to ignore. Mark was already inside, laughing with his partners near the stage. He was immaculate in his tuxedo, a man playing his favorite role, the charming, generous businessman, adored by all. When he saw Janet, the smile faltered. For a brief second, confusion flickered in his eyes, then irritation, cold and sharp. He moved toward her, his expression tightening with every step. "You're late," he said under his breath, his voice laced with warning. His eyes scanned her dress, his jaw tightening. "Where's the red gown I told you to wear?" Janet met his gaze, her voice soft but steady. "I decided silver suited me better." Mark's lips twitched in a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You always have to make things difficult, don't you?" "I'm just being myself," she replied. Her hand brushed the purse at her side, feeling the small, cold weight of the USB drive hidden inside. He leaned closer, his voice barely audible. "If you want to play games in public, fine. But you'll pay for this embarrassment later." Janet froze, her breath catching in her throat, but before fear could rise, a familiar voice interrupted. "Surprised to see both of us, Mark." Mark turned. His face went white. Susan stood just behind them, identical silver gown gleaming under the chandelier, her presence calm and unyielding. The color drained from his cheeks as his eyes darted between the two women, the real Janet before him, and her mirror standing just inches away. The air around them seemed to still, as if the music itself held its breath. "What? What is this?" he stammered, his mask slipping. "Is this supposed to be a joke?" Susan's smile was almost tender. "No joke, Mark. Just a little truth. Finally catching up with you." Janet straightened beside her, drawing quiet strength from her sister's voice. "You always said no one would believe me," she whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. "But tonight, they will." Before Mark could respond, Richard, the co-founder of Mark's company, took the stage. His jovial voice boomed through the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for joining us for this year's Coastal Business Gala. Tonight, we celebrate not only success, but integrity, the values that make our community thrive." Mark's nostrils flared at the word integrity. His eyes flicked between the sisters, calculating, desperate to regain control. "Whatever you think you're doing," he hissed, "you won't get away with it." Susan tilted her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "Neither will you." Janet's fingers tightened around the purse. Inside was the small USB drive that held months of documents, financial records, voice recordings, photographs, proof of everything. Peter and Detective Collins were already in the crowd, watching from strategic points. Gloria Martinez, the lawyer, stood near the bar in a black gown, her phone ready. One signal from Susan, and everything would begin. On stage, Richard continued. "And now, it's my great honor to present this year's Businessman of the Year award to Mark Campbell." The crowd applauded, unaware of the storm about to break. Janet's pulse pounded in her ears. Mark forced a smile, stepping forward to the stage. The lights cast a warm glow over him as Richard handed him the award, a crystal plaque that glittered like ice. Cameras flashed, applause rose. "Thank you," Mark began, his voice smooth, confident again. "It's an honor too, but then Across the ballroom, a second spotlight turned on. Susan stepped into it. "Excuse me," she said clearly, her voice carrying through the microphone she'd discreetly borrowed from the sound crew. "Before we continue the celebration, I think there's something everyone should see." The room fell silent. Mark froze mid-sentence, his smile stiffening. "Susan," he hissed, "sit down." But Susan didn't move. She nodded toward Janet, who opened her purse and handed the small USB to a technician, one of Peter's contacts, standing near the projector. Within seconds, the screen behind Mark flickered to life. First came the photos, bank statements, invoices, wire transfers. Then, audio recordings filled the air. Mark's voice, sharp and unmistakable, issuing threats, manipulating numbers, coercing employees. The words were damning. The crowd gasped, murmurs rippling like shockwaves through the room. Mark lunged toward the projector, but Susan stepped between him and the stage. "Enough," she said firmly. Security moved in, slow at first, uncertain. But then Detective Collins appeared from the side door, flashing his badge. "Mark Campbell," he said, voice steady. "You're under investigation for fraud, coercion, and domestic assault. Please step down." The mask finally shattered. Mark's composure vanished, replaced by fury and disbelief. "You can't do this! You set me up!" Janet's voice rose over the noise. "No, Mark, you set yourself up. You thought no one would ever stand against you. But here we are." The crowd parted as the officers approached. For a moment, Mark's eyes met hers, wild, wounded, cornered. Then he was led away, his protests fading under the weight of flashing cameras and whispered condemnation. The music stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, trembling, almost sacred. Janet stood still, her breath uneven. Her body trembled, not from fear, but from release, the kind that comes after years of silence. Susan reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining. "You did it!" Susan whispered. Janet turned to her, tears gathering in her eyes. "We did." Emily appeared then, pushing through the stunned guests. She ran straight to her mother, throwing her arms around her. Janet held her tightly, her body shaking as the years of fear and shame finally melted into sobs that came from somewhere deep and old. "It's over," Emily whispered. "It's finally over." Janet pulled back, brushing her daughter's hair from her face. "No, sweetheart," she said softly, smiling through tears. "It's just beginning." The crowd slowly began to applaud, not the polite, shallow applause of a gala, but something real, genuine. People who had watched and looked away were finally seeing her, seeing them. Susan glanced toward the window where the harbor lights shimmered against the dark water. The reflection of 3 women, broken, mended, unafraid, gleamed back at her. And as the night air drifted in, carrying the scent of salt and freedom, Janet took one long, steady breath and whispered to herself, barely audible, but certain, "I am strong. I am believed. I deserve respect." This time, the words didn't tremble. They glowed. The ballroom was bathed in amber light, the kind that flatters faces and hides shadows. Crystal chandeliers shimmered like captured constellations, and beneath them, Charleston's finest gathered, unaware that the night's glitter was moments away from turning to glass shards. Laughter flowed easily. Champagne flutes clinked. A string quartet played something graceful and predictable, everything perfectly in place, just as Mark liked it. At the front of the stage, Richard adjusted the microphone, his broad smile spreading as the crowd hushed. "And now," he announced, voice buoyant, "it's time for the highlight of our evening. A man whose vision and dedication have shaped our company into what it is today. Please welcome to the stage our businessman of the year, Mark Campbell." Applause rippled through the room, polite and enthusiastic. Mark rose from his table with practiced modesty, his hand pressed to his chest as if humbled. The tuxedo fit perfectly. His cufflinks gleamed like tiny mirrors. To anyone watching, he was the picture of confidence, a man whose success seemed inevitable. Janet watched him from her seat, every breath heavy with memory. He had worn that same expression on their wedding day, the charming mask, the polished smile that fooled everyone. But tonight, the mask was about to crack. She pressed her fingers against her purse, feeling the smooth metal of the USB drive inside, her pulse syncing with its shape like a heartbeat. Susan sat a few tables away, her identical silver gown blending with the sea of sequins. She caught Janet's eye for half a second, giving the smallest nod. The plan was already in motion. Mark stepped onto the stage, the applause swelling again. He adjusted the microphone, letting the crowd settle before speaking. "Thank you, Richard," he said warmly, his voice smooth as silk. "It's been a challenging few years, but with teamwork and perseverance, the screen behind him flickered. At first, no one noticed. Just a brief stutter in the slideshow, an image freezing, then shifting. Mark glanced over his shoulder, irritation flashing across his face. "Sorry, seems we're having some technical." The screen changed completely. The company logo disappeared, replaced by a bright white background. And then, black text appeared, large, unmistakable letters, scrolling slowly down the massive screen. "If you leave me, I'll destroy you." The room went silent. Another message appeared. "You think anyone will believe you? You're nothing without me." Gasps broke through the stillness like cracks in ice. People shifted in their seats, whispering. The words kept coming, a slow parade of cruelty and control. "You'll come crawling back. You always do." Mark froze, his mouth open but empty of words. His face drained of color as the texts continued to roll, each one a wound now made public. "That's enough!" he snapped, turning toward the projector booth. "Turn it off! Now!" But no one moved. From the crowd, Richard's voice cut through the stunned silence. "What the hell is this, Mark?" Mark's hands clenched at his sides. "This is some sick joke. Someone hacked the system." Before he could finish, the screen flickered again. The messages disappeared, replaced this time with spreadsheets, rows of numbers, bank account details, email exchanges, wire transfers to shell companies, altered invoices. The company name, his name, stamped across every transaction. Richard's face twisted from confusion to fury. He stepped forward, his voice low but carrying. "You've been stealing from us." Mark's eyes darted toward the audience, dozens of faces, once admiring, now turning cold. He backed away from the podium, scanning for an escape. But before he could move, a figure appeared near the stage stairs. Detective Collins, Peter's brother, standing firm, badge glinting faintly under the chandelier light. "Going somewhere, Mr. Campbell?" he asked evenly. Mark stopped. His jaw twitched, a muscle feathering near his temple. "This isn't what it looks like," he muttered, his voice cracking. "I can explain." From her seat, Janet rose. Every sound in the room seemed to fade, the music, the whispers, even her own breath. Her hands trembled as she took the microphone from the table, the cool metal grounding her. Her voice, when it came, was soft but clear. "My name is Janet Chun." Mark turned sharply, eyes wide. "Don't." She stood taller, one hand gripping the microphone, the other pressed against her stomach, as if holding herself steady. "For 12 years, this man has made me afraid to speak." The words hung in the air, fragile and heavy all at once. The crowd was utterly silent, 200 people suspended between disbelief and horror. Even the chandeliers seemed to stop shimmering, the air thick with the weight of her truth. Janet took another breath, her voice shaking but growing stronger with every word. "He hurt me, not just with his hands, but with his words, with his control. He took pieces of me until I didn't recognize myself anymore. But tonight, I'm done being afraid." Mark lunged toward her, but Colin stepped forward, his hand firm on the man's shoulder. "You might want to stay where you are." Janet didn't flinch. Her gaze locked on Mark's, steady for the first time in years. "You said no one would believe me," she whispered. "That people like you always win. But I'm standing here, and they're listening." A murmur rippled through the crowd, quiet but rising, a collective intake of breath, a human reaction to courage. Richard's voice was low, pained. "Janet, we didn't know. No one ever does," she said softly. "That's how men like him survive. They count on silence, on fear." Her throat tightened, but she kept going, her voice trembling through the ache. But fear loses its power when you start to speak, when you realize your voice matters. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, from the far side of the room, Susan began to clap. It was slow, deliberate, a rhythm of acknowledgement. Others joined, hesitant at first, then stronger. The sound grew, echoing off the marble walls, breaking through the heavy quiet. Janet lowered the microphone, her chest rising and falling. Tears shimmered at the corners of her eyes, but she didn't wipe them away. They weren't tears of weakness now. They were release. Mark stood rigid, breathing hard, his mask fully gone. All that remained was the small, angry man behind the facade. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. Susan stepped forward, her voice calm but cutting. "It already has." Detective Collins gestured to the waiting officers by the door. "Mark Campbell, you're under arrest for embezzlement, coercion, and domestic assault." The crowd parted as they approached, the sound of handcuffs snapping around his wrists sharp and final. As he was led away, Janet's knees wavered, the enormity of it all washing over her. Susan caught her, wrapping her arms around her sister. "You did it," she whispered. "You faced him." Janet pressed her forehead against Susan's shoulder, her voice breaking. "I thought I'd feel small after this. But I don't." "You're not small," Susan said, her hands steady on her back. "You were never small. He just needed you to believe it." Janet lifted her head, scanning the crowd. There were tears in some eyes, guilt in others, but more than anything, respect. People who had never seen her before were finally seeing her now. Richard approached, his expression somber. "Janet, I'm sorry. We'll make this right." She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just make sure he can't hurt anyone else." When the lights dimmed and the guests began to leave, the night air outside was soft and still. The harbor glimmered beyond the glass, the tide pulling at the moonlight. Janet stood with Susan and Emily near the entrance, their reflections faint in the window's surface. Emily slipped her hand into her mother's. "You were incredible," she said quietly. "You didn't just survive, Mama, you won." Janet smiled through her tears. "No, sweetheart, we all did." The ballroom behind them still echoed faintly with applause. But the real victory was in the silence that followed, in the peace settling over Janet's heart for the first time in years. And as they stepped out into the cool Charleston night, the air carried something light and new. Not freedom, not yet, but the first beautiful breath of it. The ballroom had gone utterly still, as though the air itself were holding its breath. The screen behind the stage glowed softly, frozen on the last damning image of Mark's deceit. For a long, fragile moment, no one moved. Then Janet lifted her gaze to the crowd, faces pale, eyes wide, the silence pressing in like an ocean. She could hear the faint hum of the projector, the soft whir of air conditioning, and her own heartbeat pounding steady and strong, like a drum summoning courage from deep inside her chest. She stepped closer to the microphone, her fingers brushing against it, no longer shaking. "There's one more thing," she said, her voice low but unwavering. Susan came to stand beside her, their gowns shimmering under the lights, two silver mirrors of strength and sisterhood. She reached for Janet's hand, intertwining their fingers in quiet solidarity. The gesture said what words never could. You are not alone anymore. Janette took a breath and held up her phone. These, she said softly, are the moments I hid. The moments no one was supposed to hear. The speakers crackled faintly as the first audio recording began to play. Mark's voice filled the ballroom, low and venomous. You think you can embarrass me? You think anyone would believe a pathetic woman like you? Gasps echoed through the crowd. His tone, sharp, cold, inescapably real, cut through every layer of pretense in that glittering room. Janet's eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. She let them hear it all. Another clip followed. His voice again, angrier this time. If you leave me, Janet, I swear I'll ruin you. Don't test me. A tremor went through the audience. Someone near the back whispered, My God. When the final clip ended, the silence that followed was suffocating. No one applauded, no one spoke. It was the kind of silence that comes when people finally see what's been hidden in plain sight. Susan squeezed her sister's hand gently, grounding her. Janet raised her chin. My sister Susan switched places with me, she said, her voice steady, each word deliberate. She risked everything, her safety, her peace, to gather the evidence you've all just seen. Because for 12 years I lived in fear. And for the first time, I wanted to live in truth. Murmurs rose among the guests. Some turned toward Susan in disbelief, realizing the impossible had been real. Two women, one story woven together by pain, and now by courage. From the corner of the room, Mark suddenly barked out a laugh, brittle and furious. Oh, come on, he said, his voice rising with false confidence. You're all falling for this? She's crazy. She's always been unstable emotional, paranoid. His eyes darted toward Richard, desperate. You know me, Rich. You know me. This is a setup. But Richard didn't answer. His face was carved in stone. Janet met Mark's eyes, her voice soft but fierce. You can call me whatever you want, but I'm not your silence anymore. There was movement near the center of the crowd. Dr. Williams, the family physician, rose from his seat. The older woman's face was pale but resolute as she made her way to the stage. Mrs. Chun, she began, her tone trembling slightly, came to me many times over the years. Each time with bruises, each time with explanations that didn't match the injuries. She paused, her eyes glistening, and each time, I wanted to believe the story she told me. But I always knew. Mark's face twisted. You can't. But before he could finish, another voice rose from the audience. I heard it too. It was Mrs. Patterson, their elderly neighbor, clutching her purse tightly to her chest. Her voice cracked with emotion. Through the walls, the shouting, the things he said, I should have done something. She shook her head, tears streaking her cheeks. I thought it wasn't my business. I was wrong. A heavy, human ache filled the room, awareness of all the quiet complicity, the looking away that keeps monsters invisible. Then, from near the back, another figure stepped forward. Linda, Mark's secretary. Her hands trembled, but she spoke anyway, her words spilling out like something long held back. He used to yell at her on the phone, she said, eyes darting between the sisters and the audience. I heard things no one should ever hear at work. Once I saw him grab her arm so hard she bruised. He told me to mind my own business. I was afraid to lose my job. Her voice broke on the last word, and she covered her face, weeping. By now, the ballroom had transformed into something entirely different. It was no longer a place of celebration, but confession, a sacred space of reckoning. The weight of truth hung thick in the air, and for the first time in years, Janet felt it lifting from her shoulders, piece by piece. She turned toward Mark, who stood surrounded by people yet utterly alone. The rage in his face was no longer powerful. It was small, frantic, exposed. You can't do this to me, he hissed. You don't get to destroy me. Susan's voice was quiet but unyielding. "You did that yourself." At that moment, the crowd shifted, parting as a young woman pushed through. Emily. Her eyes were red from crying, her hair slightly disheveled from the rush, but her presence was fierce, radiant with the courage of her mother's blood. She ran to the stage, straight into Janet's arms, her voice breaking as she cried, "I'm so proud of you, Mom!" Janet's breath caught as she held her daughter, feeling her warmth, her heartbeat pressed against hers. It was the first time in so long she'd held her child without fear, no eyes watching, no footsteps approaching, no lies to protect anyone from. Just love, just truth. The applause that followed started softly, one pair of hands, then another. But it built, growing louder, until the ballroom erupted in a standing ovation. Not for spectacle, but for survival. For the raw, breathtaking power of truth spoken aloud. Detective Collins stepped forward, his voice firm. "Mark Campbell," he said, producing the warrant from his jacket. "You are under arrest for domestic abuse, assault, and financial fraud." As the handcuffs clicked around Mark's wrists, the metallic sound echoed through the vast room like a final punctuation. Mark twisted toward Janet, his eyes burning with hatred. "You'll regret this," he spat, the last remnants of control clinging to his voice. But Janet didn't shrink this time. She stood tall, her expression calm and resolute. "No," she said softly, "you will." The officers led him away, the crowd parting once more. His reflection in the polished floor wavered and disappeared as the doors closed behind him. The silence that followed was profound, not empty, but full. Full of release, of possibility, of breath finally exhaled. Janet stood at the center of it all, the microphone still in her hand, but no longer needed. The truth had spoken for itself. Susan reached for her again, wrapping an arm around her shoulder. "It's over," she whispered. Janet leaned against her sister, a quiet, trembling smile curving her lips. "No," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but strong. "It's beginning." Emily looked up at them, her eyes shining through her tears. "Can we go home?" she asked. Janet nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, home." The word felt strange on her tongue, almost sacred. Home, not the house where she'd lived in fear, but the life she would now build. A place with open windows and laughter that wasn't forced. A place where silence no longer meant danger. Outside, the Charleston night was still warm, the scent of salt water drifting on the breeze. As the three of them stepped into the night, Susan glanced back at the glittering ballroom, now fading behind them like a closing chapter. And for the first time, Janet didn't look back. She didn't need to. The truth was no longer something to hide or fear. It was hers now, bright and unshakable, lighting the path forward. The golden light of late afternoon streamed through the tall windows of Janet's new apartment, painting the walls in soft warmth. The space was filled with small sounds of life again, Emily laughing on the phone with a college friend, the soft hiss of coffee brewing, the hum of a world finally at peace. For the first time in more than a decade, the air felt light, unstained by fear. There were no footsteps pacing outside the door, no low, threatening voice hovering over her shoulder. Just sunlight, music, and the fragile, steady rhythm of healing. It had been 6 months since that night. The night the truth broke open in front of 200 people. The night her silence ended. Since then, so much had changed that sometimes Janet woke up and had to remind herself it was real. The divorce was finalized. She had stood before the judge, shoulders squared, heart trembling, and listened as her marriage was dissolved with a clean strike of a gavel. For years, she had imagined that moment as an ending, but when it came, it felt like birth. Her settlement had come through, fair and square, enough for her and Emily to begin again. The irony wasn't lost on her. How the very man who had tried to control every breath she took had now, through justice, provided the means for her freedom. Mark was serving time. Embezzlement, fraud, assault. The list was long. And as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered darker truths. The suspicious death of his first wife, the pattern of fear he left behind wherever he went. Janet no longer followed the updates closely. She didn't need to. She had given the truth to the world. What the world did with it was no longer her burden. That morning, she stood by her window watering a small plant, a gift from Susan on moving day. The leaves were a brilliant green, stretching toward the light. Janet smiled faintly. It was thriving, just like her. A knock came at the door, light and familiar. "Come in," she called. Susan stepped in, carrying a box of pastries from their favorite cafe. "I brought reinforcements," she said, grinning. Caffeine and sugar, the sacred combination of sisters. Janet laughed, motioning for her to sit. "You've been spoiling me since all this began. That's what sisters are for," Susan said simply, setting the box down. They poured coffee, the rich aroma filling the air. For a while, they just sat there in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes after surviving something together that no one else could understand. Finally, Janet spoke, her voice soft. "You gave me my life back." Susan looked at her, her smile warm and full of pride. "No, sister," she said gently. "I just reminded you of your strength. You saved yourself." The words sank deep into Janet's heart. For so long she had defined herself by what she had endured. Now, she could begin to define herself by what she had become. They sipped their coffee, the quiet between them peaceful. Through the open window, the sounds of Charleston drifted in the distant laughter of children. A dog barking somewhere, the faint cry of a seagull circling over the harbor. Life, ordinary and precious. Emily appeared then, her hair pulled back, a stack of textbooks in her arms. "Hey, Mom." "Hey, Aunt Susan," she said, dropping into a chair with a smile that still made Janet's heart swell. "How's college life treating you?" Susan asked, teasing. Emily rolled her eyes but smiled. "It's amazing. Hard, but amazing. I got accepted into the social work program." Janet's breath caught, and tears pricked her eyes. "Oh, Emily, that's wonderful." Emily nodded, her voice soft but certain. "I want to help people like you, Mom. People who think they can't start over." Janet reached across the table, squeezing her daughter's hand. "You already are," she whispered. Later that afternoon, they all met Peter at the waterfront. The tide was low, and the air smelled faintly of salt and magnolia. The sun was beginning to sink, washing the water in soft gold and pink. Peter slipped his arm around Susan's shoulders, his touch easy and affectionate. "I'm married to a hero, you know that?" he said, his tone light but full of sincerity. Susan shook her head, smiling. "No heroes here," she said, "just someone who couldn't stand by and watch injustice." Peter kissed her temple. "That's what makes you one." Janet watched them, her heart swelling with gratitude. For years, she had been surrounded by walls. Now, she was surrounded by people who saw her not as fragile, but as strong, reborn, whole. They walked slowly along the waterfront promenade, the waves whispering against the shore. The twins moved side by side, their reflections shimmering in the water like two branches of the same tree, once separated, now growing again in the same direction. For a long while, they said nothing. The world spoke for them, the gulls calling overhead, the rhythm of the waves, the laughter of families nearby. Finally, Susan glanced at her sister. "Do you ever think about that night?" Janet nodded, her expression calm. "Sometimes, but not with fear anymore. It's strange. The things that once broke you become the proof that you survived." They reached the railing overlooking the water, and Janet leaned against it, her hair lifting in the soft evening breeze. "I used to think freedom meant forgetting. she said quietly. But now I know it means remembering without pain. Susan smiled. That's healing, Jan. That's what it looks like. The sun dipped lower, a glowing sphere melting into the horizon. Its reflection spread across the water, turning everything to liquid gold. Janet closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, letting the warmth touch her skin. When she opened them again, she looked at her sister, her daughter, and the man who had stood beside them through it all. I spent so long being afraid, she said softly. Afraid of leaving, afraid of being alone, afraid of not being believed. But the truth is, freedom was waiting on the other side of fear. I just had to step through it. Emily reached for her hand. And you did, she said. They stood there as the last light of day wrapped around them, quiet and whole. The years of pain, the lies, the silence, they were still part of her story, but no longer the ending. They were the ashes from which she had risen, stronger and more luminous than before. Somewhere behind them, the city lights began to flicker on, one by one windows glowing like tiny beacons of hope. Janet smiled, feeling something shift inside her, something unbreakable and alive. Ready to go home? Susan asked softly. Janet turned toward her, eyes glistening. I already am. They began walking back, their steps unhurried, the wind carrying laughter ahead of them. The harbor behind them glowed under the fading sky, the horizon open and endless. And for the first time, Janet felt completely free, not because she had escaped her past, but because she had transformed it. Freedom wasn't about forgetting. It was about reclaiming every piece of who she was. The frightened woman, the brave sister, the healing mother, and knowing she was all of them and more. As the waves lapped gently against the shore, she whispered to herself, "We made it." Her words disappeared into the wind, but their truth lingered, echoing softly across the water. And so, beneath the fading light of Charleston sunset, two sisters who had once shared pain now shared peace, walking forward together, rising, always, from the ashes. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of courage, healing, and second chances. Your support helps these voices continue to rise.